Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming, and sorry about the delay. I'm Peggy Sattler, MPP for London West, and the Women's Issues Critic for the Ontario NDP Caucus. And I'm pleased this morning to have the opportunity to talk about my private member's bill, the Domestic and Sexual Violence Workplace Leave, Accommodation and Training Act, which I will be reintroducing into the legislature this afternoon. I am going to be providing an update on what has happened since my bill passed unanimously after second reading debate in the last session of the legislature. And I am joined this morning by three panelists who will also be sharing their perspective on the importance of this bill. So I'd like to welcome Barb McQuarrie, who is Community Director for the Centre for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University, and was also one of the researchers who was involved in the Canadian Labour Congress study called Can Work Be Safe When Home Isn't? I'd also like to welcome Patty Coates, Secretary-Treasurer of the Ontario Federation of Labour, and Maureen Adams, who is Director of Advocacy and Communications for the YWCA Toronto. And I want to acknowledge my colleague, Catherine Fife, another member of the NDP caucus, who has joined us this morning. So the purpose of my private member's bill is to enable workers who've experienced domestic violence or sexual violence or have children who've experienced these forms of violence to get the support they need without jeopardizing their employment. The bill provides up to 10 days of paid leave plus reasonable unpaid leave to do things like seeing a doctor, talking to a counselor, moving residence, meeting with police, or going to court. We know from the experience of Lori DuPont and Teresa Vince, women who were murdered by their abusers, that violence often follows women to work, which is why this bill allows employees to request changes to hours of work or to transfer to a different location. The bill also requires mandatory workplace training on domestic violence and sexual violence to help coworkers recognize the warning signs and to deal with disclosures. Over the spring and summer, there have been a number of developments in connection with this bill, identifying domestic violence and sexual violence as significant public health concerns. Health units across the province are passing resolutions endorsing the bill. Groups like the City of London's Mayor's Task Force to End Poverty are urging support for the bill as an important poverty reduction strategy. The bill is specifically referenced in the Special Advisor's interim report on the Changing Workplaces Review as one of the options that must be considered when the government is looking at changes to the Employment Standards Act. And finally, a federal government memo recently revealed that the federal Liberals are also reviewing the bill, specifically the flexible work provisions, and certainly this opens up the opportunity for unpaid leave to be covered through the employment insurance benefits. So before I turn it over to the other panelists, I just wanted to share a story that I heard during a roundtable in Kingston on my bill. One of the participants was a woman who had been diagnosed with PTSD after years of abuse. Somehow she found the strength and the courage to leave her abusive partner and was preparing to enter the workforce for the very first time. She spoke about her anxiety of what would happen if she started a job and had a trigger that brought back the trauma that she had experienced for all those years. And she said that for her, this bill would provide a critical safety net if she found herself unable to go to work because of the violence that she had experienced. So her story reinforced for me the fundamental importance of the bill, not just for those who are already in the workplace, but also for those who may be looking for employment for the very first time. I now wanted to ask Barb to share some of the research that informed the initial development of the bill.
Thank you, Peggy. And I do have copies of the report if anyone would like one afterwards. So our research was a collaboration between Western University and the Canadian Labour Congress. We released our results in November 2014. Over 8,400 people completed our survey on the impacts of domestic violence on workers and the workplace. I want to say that over 80% of our respondents were in unionized jobs. And what that means is that we still don't know a lot about how domestic violence impacts precarious workers. But we can only assume that without the protections that unions offer, those impacts are even more serious. So what did we find? We found that fully 1/3 of respondents had experienced domestic violence at some point in their life. Aboriginal respondents, people with disabilities, gay, lesbian, bisexual respondents reported, and women reported higher rates of victimization. Trans people reported the highest rates of all, with almost 65% experiencing domestic violence in their lifetime. For over half of those people who had experienced domestic violence, it followed them to work. It followed them with abusive phone calls, stalking and harassment near the workplace, the abuser physically showing up at work, abusive emails, and the abuser contacting the employer and co-workers to ask questions. Almost 40% of those who had experienced domestic violence said it did affect their ability to get to work as well. They talked about things like having their money for transit stolen, hiding car keys, destroying work clothes, not showing up for childcare, and even being physically restrained so they couldn't get out of the house. Over 80% of workers who experienced domestic violence found that it did negatively affect their work performance. They said that they were tired, they were distracted, and they were unwell. Almost 10% of them said that they had actually lost a job due to the impacts of domestic violence on their work. And remember, again, these are unionized workers, for the most part, in secure jobs. Over 40% of them did tell somebody at work what was happening to them. Most commonly, they told co-workers, but they also told supervisors, union reps, and HR reps. The co-workers reported that they were affected too. They were dealing with frequent phone calls, messages, emails. Sometimes they had an increased workload, and they were stressed and concerned about what was happening to their co-workers. So the recommendations from our report were for other provinces to follow Ontario's lead in amending occupational health and safety legislation to give employers responsibility for preventing and responding to domestic violence. To include domestic violence-related amendments in federal and provincial labor standards legislation to provide flexible work arrangements and paid domestic violence leave. To negotiate specific supports regarding domestic violence into collective agreements, to build on successful employer-led initiatives, and finally, to educate managers, supervisors, and workers about domestic violence in the workplace and provide specific protocols to support victims and survivors. So, as you heard, many of our recommendations are covered off in Peggy's spiel. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. I am now going to ask Patty Coates from the Ontario Federation of Labour to offer the labour perspective on the bill.
Thank you, Peggy. Good morning. The Ontario Federation of Labour fully supports this essential bill, and we applaud Peggy and the NDP for reintroducing it. This legislation would serve as an important tool for real change. The right to paid leave and workplace education would ensure that women who fear for their own lives or for their family's well-being will not have to face an extremely difficult choice between their safety and their job. Support from their place of work can be significant to their capacity to reestablish themselves in a safe environment. Pay without the fear of losing a day's wage allows a woman to save money to make the necessary changes to be safe and have some financial stability. Paid leave means victims will have the security of knowing they are free to seek urgent medical care, making sure their children are safe and secure, attend legal appointments and court appearances, and to make arrangements to relocate to a safe place. With paid leave, survivors can both escape domestic violence and keep their jobs. We know that economic and job security is often the primary factors that influences a woman's decision to leave an abuser or not to return to an abusive situation. Women leaving violent relationships struggle to reestablish themselves and their children and face dramatic financial barriers in doing so. With paid leave, We know survivors can both escape the domestic violence and keep their jobs and prevent many women from entering into the spiral of poverty or the fear of losing their home. Paid time off can ultimately prevent women from losing their confidence and ability to work and help survivors become independent again. It's not just knowing that a female worker has access to paid leave for those experiencing sexual or domestic violence. It's ensuring that the workers can exercise their right and take this leave without repercussions. There are many naysayers who believe that this will be a huge cost to employers, that employees will take advantage of this accommodation. This is just not true. Statistics from Australia prove that those who require this paid leave didn't take more than 2 or 3 days, and employers have embraced this change. Sexual and/or domestic violence leave is increasingly becoming a key issue in Ontario workplaces. This goes beyond politics. It's about the well-being and safety of women and their families, so we call for a bipartisan approach. If Kathleen Wynne and Patrick Brown are serious about tackling sexual and/or domestic violence, they must commit to quick passage of this proposed legislation. Today, the Ontario Federation of Labour is calling on all political parties to support this private member's bill, which will go a long way in providing avenues to safety and security for working women of Ontario. And this is the Ontario we want. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patty. I now wanted to ask Maureen Adams from the YWCA Toronto to offer a few comments from the community perspective.
Thank you so much. YWCA strongly supports this bill, both as an employer and as a service provider. We're pleased that the bill is supported by all 3 political parties who recognize the importance of women and families rebuilding their lives after fleeing violence. We also endorse the bill because women in our YWCA programs have told us what they need. We've had consultations across the association where we serve about 5,000 women who've experienced violence annually, and they have told us that they need support. Particularly, my emphasis today is going to be on legal support. So they've told us that they want to build stability and safety for themselves and their children, and this means for them protection, which often comes through criminal court proceedings, financial security, which often comes through family court proceedings for custody and child support proceedings, and stability as immigrants through protecting their legal status in Canada. All of these processes are critically important in helping women rebuild safe futures, and most require them to be available for legal procedures during normal work hours. Courts do not generally operate in the evening, and women often can arrive at court at 10 in the morning and not have their case go forward till well into the day. So the flexibility of time off and flexible hours to enable women to enforce their legal rights in those 3 areas has been identified by our participants as critically important. And we are an employer, and we are a unionized employer, and we have some provisions in our collective agreement now that would enable women to have time off for legal matters, for moving if they need to. But this expansion enables women to cover every aspect of their lives that they might need to when they're fleeing violence. And through stability, women want to work. They don't want to be jeopardized or penalized or fear that they'll have a negative impact in the workplace, either by not getting hours or by losing their jobs. Women have also told us they want to work. They want to rebuild economic futures for their families. They want to participate in their communities. And once these steps are in place that allow women to exercise those rights, they can settle into work in a supportive environment and build strong futures for their families. So really we're here today to bring forward the voices of the women who are fleeing violence to this dialogue. And we thank you for bringing the legislation forward and hope that it will be expedited. And we'll have it before us soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I now wanted to ask if you had any questions for any of us.
Why didn't this carry through prorogation?
It passed second reading unanimously and then is referred to a standing committee, and each standing committee decides its own kind of order of business. So the bill was in the list of possible pieces of legislation to be reviewed by the committee, but was never brought to the top of the list to receive public input after it was initially passed second reading.
You had to show, how much time was lost, I guess, to prorogation then?
How much time was?
Time was lost by prorogation.
The clock goes right back to the very beginning. So I have to go through the whole process of reintroducing, waiting to bring the bill forward for second reading during private members' business. Then it will, presumably it was passed last time, so I'm hopeful that there will be unanimous support once again. Then it would have to go back to a committee, then wait for public input. But there is an opportunity for the government to just take this bill and bring it forward through the Employment Standards Act amendments. They're currently working on those amendments. We know that as part of the Changing Workplaces review. So we really want to see this bill come forward, preferably with government legislation, but possibly through the private members process.
I understand you carried over your intern's bill?
That had been carried over because of a pre-prorogation agreement among the three parties that one was going to receive public input.
That's what I was wondering, why you didn't do the same for this one here to get it through faster.
Yeah, at the time there was only the only bill that the three parties agreed on was that bill. So that bill did go. That was the only private members bill of any of the three parties that was carried over.
I guess that's what I'm wondering about. Why was it that bill and not this one? It seems like there's some support for it.
Yeah, I don't know. That was a negotiation among the three House leaders. Did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask? Okay. Okay, we're done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in person.
Yes.